Hi folks, it's Dr. DiBiase, and tonight we're going to talk about finding, evaluating, and analyzing institutional sources. Before we begin, I want to mention this evening's sponsor, Giant Mug of Coffee. Giant Mug of Coffee for when your kids won't go to sleep and it's 10:30 at night. So, we're going to be using a lot of different kinds of sources for this project, partly because different sources help us answer different questions, and it's good to get your feet wet in terms of engaging in different kinds of research methodologies. So, for example, we're going to be looking at institutional sources, and part of that might involve learning how to do some archival research. We're going to look at scholarly sources so that we have a better sense of what a peer-reviewed scholarly article looks like and what function it serves. And we're going to be doing interviews as well to cover other kinds of gaps in our knowledge about the things that we're researching. And we'll talk about each of these as we move along, but we're going to start tonight with institutional sources. One, because they tend to be a bit more accessible. You don't have to wait to schedule an interview. The content that goes along with institutional sources tends to be more accessible than scholarly articles because it's usually written for a more general audience. Um, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to access when we start getting into some of the archival stuff that you might want to take a look at, but we have a really good archives department at Fairfield University, and they have a pretty solid archive website that we're going to look at later that makes it a little bit easier to navigate some of that. So, finding institutional sources. Well, even before we get to that, what is an institutional source? Well, because the project is trying to figure out how Fairfield University sponsors the acquisition of a literacy or a set of literacies, or how it supports the process by which someone comes into a particular kind of discourse, then we definitely want to look at sort of official documents that tell us a little bit about how the university talks about how it goes about doing this process, because obviously in the process of trying to recruit students or publicize their programs or create a good impression for the public, um, the university at various levels has a real interest in showcasing the ways in which it helps sponsor students' success in their chosen major or field. Um, Now, there are lots of different ways that we can go about finding institutional sources, right? Some of these sources are going to come from the archives. So let's say you wanted to get a sense of how, what it meant to be a, let's just say English major for the time being. Let's say we want to figure out how being an English major has changed over time. We might want to do some archival work, right? So we might go into old issues of the Mirror, right? So that's the Fairfield University newspaper. Its original name was different, and I'm actually blanking on the original name, but it's been the Mirror for a very long time. Um, or you might look at how faculty have changed over time, or how the composition of faculty has changed over time by going through back issues of the Manor, which is Fairfield University's yearbook. And I'll show you really quickly a good way to do that. So if you go to librarybestbets.fairfield.edu/ffldu history, you'll be brought to a landing page for our archives and special collections. And I really love this page for a lot of reasons. Um, but you can see here under digital collections, I should drop that down a little bit because I might be covering it. But under digital collections, we have an online database of lots of historical material related to Fairfield. So we have Fairfield University newspapers. Okay, so it's called the Stag. From 1947 to 1970, the newspaper was called the Stag. Um, Starting in the 70s, it was referred to as the Mirror. We have back issues of the Manor going back quite some time. Course catalogs. So, like, if you want to see how the courses that were offered in a particular, uh, major changed over time, that's a great way of looking at it. Journals, newsletters, histories, reports. There's a ton of material going back, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, uh, years of our university's history that could give you a way to contextualize the work that you're doing in this project. Because as Brant notes, conceptions of literacy change over time as to how those literacies are sponsored, and we can extrapolate that out to G to talk about how what a discourse sort of looks like, feels like, acts like, shifts over time as well. The university website is also a good place to look for institutional sources, and that might involve looking at either like school or department websites. So if you're doing like the School of Nursing, right, you might go just like to the School of Nursing, homepage and sort of poke around. If you're looking at a specific discourse tied to a major in either like arts and sciences or one of the specific business majors, then you could look at those department pages to see how they talk about their mission, their role at the university, programming that they offer, opportunities for students, right? It's like internships, right? Would be a good way of looking to see how a particular program um, thinks about sponsoring literacy in that way. I know I just got an email today about the English department needing someone to step into the role of like internship director, right? So you might want to look to see whether your chosen discourse has some reference to that. Um, you might go back to Media Center or WVOF Archive. So the Media Center is where Stags TV is currently located. Years and years and years ago, it used to be called the Ham Channel. Um, but they have a pretty extensive video archive, dating back quite some time, that could give you some insight into how students were talking about different issues back in the day, or um, the kinds of programming that was running that might be tied to particular, majors, etc. I don't know how useful all of that will be, but it's something that you could explore. Another way of finding institutional sources is to like explore your university spaces, right? So look at flyers that are up around the campus. Go to department floors, right? So if you want to know more about the psychology department, go to the fourth floor of Banno and see the posters that are hanging up in the walls, on the walls. Check out the handouts or the flyers that are posted. Check out the advertisements for studies that are going on, or examples of student work that's being displayed, right? The large academic posters that are on display. And that could give you some possible starting points for thinking about the ways in which sponsorship occurs on campus. When it comes to evaluating institutional sources, and I'll note these categories really apply to all of the sources that we're going to be talking about, but I will discuss how they apply specifically to institutional sources in this presentation. So, okay, when we talk about reliability, was the author an authority on the thing that they were talking about? So a good example of this would be if you were to look at an old Mirror article, right, a student newspaper article, and there was like an op-ed on changes that were going on to a particular program. Um, you would want to understand like what was the student's background when they were writing that, right? Was this a student who had a lot of experience? Is it clear based on the way that they wrote up the article that they knew what they were talking about? Are their sources reliable? So you want to make sure that when you're looking at these sources that they are an authority on the thing that they're talking about. Now I should note, right, ideally because these are institutional sources, we should for the most part be able to trust that they are reliable, or at least that they're not trying to like intentionally deceive us. But that said, you want to make sure that you're thinking about what problematic biases might exist. You would want to think about, if there's an older document, there are cases where you might find an article that says, well, the Department of Biology is going to be investing in this new lab space, and you might say, oh, well, that was an example of how they support student literacy, but like you actually want to double check to make sure that that investment actually happened, right? That kind of sponsorship actually did transpire, because it's not uncommon for a department or a school to sort of promise, new faculty lines or new research space or other kinds of resources, and then for that to happen to fall through for any number of reasons. So if you're looking at stuff that talks about how the institution, whether at the department level or the larger university level, is supporting student success in a particular discourse, you want to make sure that what they said they were going to do actually did get done. Another thing you want to think about, and this kind of goes back to the point I made before, and this will also come back when we talk more about interviews, but does the source present a prevalent view of an issue or an idiosyncratic view? So like, if you were to talk to, just to go to the interviews for a moment, if you were to have an interview with a faculty member, are you getting like that one faculty member's opinions, or are they trying to represent the broader feelings of their department when they're responding, right? These are things that you're going to want to suss out. And the same thing goes for sources that you're looking at in terms of institutional sources, whether it's the Mirror or the Manor. whenever you're getting a particular individual's take from the institution, whether it's like a press release, right, with an interview from an administrator, you want to make sure that the view that they are expressing is one that is accurate and one that seems to be at least relatively widely shared among other members of the institution. Otherwise, it may not be a representative kind of source. You also want to consider the relevance of your sources, right? So essentially, right, how does this source help you answer your central questions? And we'll get more into this when we talk about analyzing our sources, but thinking about, does it speak to any of the elements that G establishes? That's a big one to be thinking about. Are there ways to connect the source back to issues of sponsorship or literacy or discourse or the way that we see any of these on our campus environment? And again, when we talk about analyzing these sources, we'll come back to this a little bit in greater detail. But again, if you're looking at a source, how does it tie back to the major research questions that you're trying to ask as a group? You're also going to want to consider timeliness. So I think that there is actually a lot of value in looking at older sources to see how the institution has changed, how literacy expectations have changed, how sponsorship of that literacy has changed. That said, you want to make sure you're aware of how old the source is that you're looking at. And be careful here, right? Because sometimes you might find a source and it has a date on it, but that's really the date when it was added to an archive, not the date of its actual publication. So you're always going to want to double check. If it is an older source, is the information still current, right? So a good example of this would be, up until, maybe 2 years ago, anything that you found that talked about the Dolan School of Business would not be referring to the incredibly nice, very, very new construction that the business school now has access to. It would be referring to the older building located on on the farther edge of campus. If the information is no longer current, right, how have things changed? Why might that matter? Is it helpful to think about how things have changed, or is it not really relevant to the conversation that you're having now? And more broadly, and again, this sort of, now we're starting to bleed a little bit into analysis, but like, what might these changes tell us about how what it means to be literate has changed over time? Finally, you're going to think about coverage, particularly because you're working as a group. How does this source fit into the bigger picture of all the other kinds of sources that you're looking at? And that can be tricky to answer at the beginning of the process because you may not know what the other things that you're going to be looking at are going to cover. But in theory, by thinking about the needs that the sources that you're looking at are meeting, right, these institutional sources, that can help you start thinking about, okay, well then I'm going to need to follow up on this with some scholarly work, or I'm going to have to ask some interview questions to build off of what I'm seeing in this archival piece. You're going to, right, this ties into thinking about, again, how the source affects what other kinds of sources you might need to locate. Again, what questions does the source answer? And alternatively, what kinds of questions does the source raise? And that helps you figure out, again, how it fits into the bigger picture of your research, right? So if it's answering some questions really well that your group has, then you might be able to say, okay, well, this covers that element. But on the other hand, if it starts raising new questions, then that gives you some inspiration for what else you have to look for as you're building out these annotated bibliographies across the 3, 4, or 5 members of your group. When we talk about analyzing institutional sources, and again, this is going to come back to a lot of different sources we're looking at, but let's just focus right now on the institutional ones, right? We're thinking in terms of literacy, discourse, and sponsorship. So again, with literacy, we're really asking the question, what does it mean to be literate in this particular context? So what do these institutional sources tell us about the genres that students need to be able to read and write and compose in? Are there certain core texts that students are expected to be familiar with? Whether that's specific texts or authors, etc. Core concepts, right? You can go back to the idea of threshold concepts. So are there threshold concepts that students need to pick up? What technologies are associated with being literate in this particular area? What are the rhetorical values, right? What is valued in the writing itself, right? So what kinds of tone do you have to take? What makes for a good argument? What kinds of strategies do writers in this particular area need to be able to execute in order to demonstrate their literacy? And when we're thinking about discourse, again, what does this institutional source tell us about um, these different categories: saying, writing, being, doing, valuing, believing, right? Saying, what is talked about, how, why, within this, this particular context. What do we write about, how and why? Who belongs? What activities do people engage in? What do members of this group see as important? And how do we know that? And then finally, what are some of the fundamental assumptions of the discourse? So, like if I was looking at, let's look at a few of these. If I'm looking at a department's website, right? Well, that's probably going to give us some insight into the kinds of values that that department holds, right? It might give us some sense on the kinds of things that people do in this discourse, right? You could look at the programs they offer, the internships they offer, the kinds of classes that they take, right? Um, in terms of saying or writing, you might find some of that in the course catalog, right? So there's lots of different ways to kind of think through these kinds of questions, but these are ones that you want in the back of your head as you're trying to assess how these sources might be useful to what you're looking at as a group. And then finally, if we're thinking about analyzing in terms of sponsorship, we're looking at different levels, right? So, and this is particularly important in the context of institutional sponsors. So, like, are we looking at sponsorship at the university level? So, I'll give you a few examples, right? Um, and you don't have to use these for your project, but like in theory, the alumni office and the ability to sort of put current students into contact with alumni from their program could be a form of sponsorship, right? The Math Center and the Writing Center are institutional approaches to sponsoring lots of different kinds of literacies and discourses, um, scholarships, etc. At the school or department or program level, right? The kinds of courses that are offered, the kinds of faculty that are hired, the areas of expertise that they convey, uh, research opportunities, scholarship opportunities. Actually, thinking about those, I'm thinking about going back to the institutional or university level, things like our Office for Scholarly, scholarly and creative engagement that helps students like develop Fulbright scholarship applications, right, to further their studies. But back to school and department, right? What kinds of research opportunities, internship opportunities, creative opportunities are available and encouraged within those departments? And at the student level, we shouldn't lose sight of this, right? There are lots of sort of student level forms of sponsorship that occur as well, right? Many discourses, right, represented by various majors or programs or schools, um, have student organizations, whether those are honor societies or clubs, that work to help familiarize students, even though they might not frame it this way, right, but with the discourse of that particular field. Um, as well as providing opportunities to sort of sponsor one another through seniors kind of mentoring underclassmen, um, or just giving members of a particular discourse or aspiring members of that discourse an opportunity to socialize with one another and learn from one another as well. So as you're thinking about institutional sources this week, and I'd really like you to focus on that as you're thinking through your sources for the first part of the annotated bibliography, just keep some of the things that we've talked about in mind. And of course, I'll be available in office hours to talk through these ideas, and we'll be talking about them more during our meeting this Friday. So good luck as you're working on the projects, and I will be in touch.